Hi, thank you for tuning in. My name is Hester Shadé, and I'm a senior lecturer in European history at the University of Exeter. I'm interested in the uses and abuses of the past, including classical reception and the history of scholarship, and my research focuses on humanism in the Italian Renaissance. At the moment, I hold a Boulston Senior Fellowship at the British School at Rome, where I'm now recording this. It's a 3-month fellowship for a project called Roman Relics and Renaissance Collectors. So this is an ongoing project. I'm 2 months in as we speak, so this paper should be seen as a research update rather than a finished product. My primary aim really is to show my colleagues here at the BSR, the scholars, the artists and the staff, what I've been up to so far. So, points of order, we're trialing a hybrid format. So you can watch this talk at any time from now to 7 December 2020. At 6 p.m. European time on Monday, 7 December, we have the live event, which will be basically me giving a brief introduction again about this topic, followed then by a discussion. So you can ask any questions you may have then via the chat function, but you can also pre-submit questions or comments or suggestions or whatnot at any time between now and then, and that would actually be quite nice because that will give me time to think about what you have to say. So if you want to pre-submit questions or comments, you can do that at the address here, info@bsrome.it. And this live session should run for about 45 minutes. So it's a bit of an experiment, but I thought it'd be more engaging and less tiring than live streaming the whole thing in one go in 90 minutes straight. So I hope this will work out. So without further ado then, the main question of my project is, at what point does Roman rubble become a collectible? And this question, in fact, may be read as a proxy for the transition from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. As any medievalist can, and indeed will tell you, antiquity was never lost. Many of the Latin authors were read throughout the Middle Ages. Much of the architecture and monuments that we still see in Rome today were obviously there all along. So the change from Middle Ages to Renaissance is not really about availability, the availability of the antique. It's rather about the faculty to see these things in a particular way, and hence about a will to look for them. Now, when the Renaissance happens in Rome is debatable. Some scholars have it start with the building projects of Pope Sixtus IV, so in the 1470s. Some say it starts with the humanist Pope Nicholas V, who died in 1455. I think there's a good case to be made for the papacy of Martin V as a turning point, or in any case, a new beginning, for this is the definitive return of the papacy to Rome after the Western Schism, and prior to that, the papacy's exile to Avignon. So Martin was elected at the Council of Constance in 1417 and then made his entry into the city of Rome in 1420. The return of the Pope obviously meant a great change in Rome's fortunes. There's an influx of money, a boost to the economy, a drive to recreate the city in the image of its refound glory, inevitably in dialogue with its ancient remains. More ambivalently, there's also a reconfiguration of Rome as its own political entity, like a self-governing commune, to become more of an appendage, really, to Vatican City, basically a city governed by a papal monarch and his court, the Curia. For this lecture, I'm looking at one member of the papal Curia under Martin V, namely Cencio de' Rustici, who was born sometime around, well, between 1380 and 1390 and died in 1445. He called himself in Latin Cincius Romanus. And he worked in papal curia from around 1405 to his death. And from 1417, sorry, I see on my slide I wrote 1411, but it should be 1417, in the rank of apostolic secretary, which is a high rank. But he was also a native Roman with connections to the city elite, as well as to the papal entourage. Now, one reason why he's interesting is that he was a colleague and close friend of Poggio Bracciolini. I was going to say Poggio Bracciolini, the famous Florentine humanist. Actually, I'm not really sure he's that famous beyond the rather niche market of humanist scholarship. He is as famous, though, as humanism gets. He's the guy who discovers the ancient manuscripts in the monastery of St. Gallen in Switzerland, Lucretius Quintilian, more of Cicero. He's also the person who designs the humanist script that's the basis for our Times New Roman font. And Poggio spent almost his entire life in the Roman Curia, so in that sense, it's questionable really how Florentine he was. In any case, Poggio is well studied, partly by me, in fact, but there's not that much about Cencio, so what I wanted to do here is sort of try and flesh him out a bit. And what's helpful is that we can partly see this figure of Cencio, who himself didn't publish very much, through the documentation that is preserved by Poggio, but also we can sort of map him against Poggio, like seeing how their careers and interests are similar, but also maybe different. And again, as I sort of indicated, we can try and embed Cencio in the local Roman scene, like compare the Rustici to other Roman families of a similar rank, compare their careers, their interest, and also consider how they engage with the antiquities of Rome and indeed with the idea of the city of Rome itself. So, starting then with putting Cencio on the map, literally, where he lived. So another curial colleague, Flavio Biondo, the famous antiquarian, writes the following in Roma Instaurata. He says, it's probable that the baths of Agrippa were those which we now see adjoining the Pantheon from the direction of Minerva, which encompass the notable houses of the Porcari and of Cencio Rustici, our colleague, and of Battista Leni, and also of Giorgio Cesarini, the proto-notary. Now, as Rome travelers know, the baths of Agrippa are indeed behind the Pantheon, and they're still lived in today, as you see here in this photo of the Via dell'Arco della Ciambella. If you put this on Google Map, I've marked the arch that you saw in the photo at the bottom, and to the right you see a plan, a reconstruction of the baths of Agrippa as they probably were, and the arch is likely to be the section marked F on the plan. Now, also on the map, you see that this block isn't exactly what in Latin you'd call contiguous, like adjoining with the Pantheon, because they're actually separated by two streets. So one immediately behind the Pantheon, which is very narrow, and then a broader street south of that is slightly curved. Now, interestingly, if you look at the earliest usable map of Rome, that is the Buffalini of 1551, then it seems that that first block is actually touching the Pantheon. And the map is obviously at an angle here, so the north is the top left corner. And then you see behind the Pantheon a dotted line, which is a colonnade. And the Roman bath specialist here at the BSR suggested that originally there may have been a series of arches, because as you can see, the dots really line up neatly with dots on the other side of the wall. So there were probably arches spanning a portico that later became a street. So thanks, Connigan, for all your help. Finally, as Biondo wrote, the house of Cencio was visible from Minerva, the region of Minerva, which is the Santa Maria sopra Minerva, which is the church you see slightly on the right. And indeed, a straight line from there gets you exactly in that block, which was at the time joining the Pantheon. So that is where Cencio lived, on the edge of Rione Pigna. Santa Maria sopra Minerva is also where Cencio lies buried. And presumably this is because it was his local parish church, I mean, very much a local parish church. But note, it's also an important church. It's the headquarters, or was the headquarters of the Dominicans in Rome, so the counterparts of the Franciscans at Santa Maria in Araceli. It was also the location of the papal conclave for the election of Nicholas V in 1447. So it became a family tradition for the Rustici to be buried there. In 1463, Cencio's wife Agnese had her burial in Minerva for the price of 50 florins. And in 1482, his son Marcello was also buried there. And he was, like his father, a papal secretary. And a colleague of him from the Curia commented on the event as follows. He says, his family organized a big funeral, and we, his colleagues, were all in formal dress, accompanying the funerary procession from these houses to the church of Minerva, where the body was placed in the tomb of his forebears with religious rites. The whole of the Roman nobility was there, and any number of dignitaries from the papal curia, even some cardinal families. And his obituary was read in public by some friar from that church, but in a rather cold manner, I think for lack of skill on his part, or maybe because of time pressures. So, despite this, not very oratorically gifted friar, the event itself sounds rather grand. But note that this is a generation of Cencio's son, Marcello. Cencio's own tomb, which Marcello's body was apparently originally added to, was likely to be a much less opulent affair. And I say this because it was restored in 1487, or alterated in any case, for both Cencio and Marcello by Cencio's grandson, Marcello's son, Antonio. And that may, of course, be because of different tastes, but it's more likely that it also has to do with different means. So likely they've got more money later and also a higher social rank, and they're remodeling their tombs to reflect that. So the monument for Cencio that you can still see today, although actually at the moment the church is being restored, and that means you can only go in after dark, so actually you can't see very much at all. So thanks to Paul, who managed to nonetheless shoot usable photos for me there. So here you see Cencio himself, and also sort of on the bottom of the image there is an inscription which I've transcribed and translated here. There is the tomb of Cencio's other sons, Agapito and Paolo, both of whom predeceased Marcello, and this tomb is paid for by Paolo's children in 1482. So again, this is done retrospectively since Agapito actually died in 1463. Possibly all of this was meant to become a family chapel for the Rustici at the far end of the right transept. In fact, the verger of Santa Maria suggested to me that the door, which now separates the two graves, was added later, and indeed it's a strange place for a door to be. If so, the chapel really was an ambitious affair in terms of space. Be it as it may, the monuments themselves, probably replacing something more modern, more modest, suggest a sort of social mobility from like between the early half of the 15th century and the later 15th century. And if so, this is a very Roman story of social mobility in the 15th century. Because backtracking a little bit, in medieval Rome, there were two baronial families that dominated the city, who were princes on an Italian level and indeed on a European level. They owned lots of territories outside Rome. The most famous of the two are the Orsini and the Colonna, but there's also the Savelli and Conti. In the 14th century, we see the advent of a new class of more local Roman nobles whose wealth derived from agriculture near and indeed within the city of Rome itself, mostly cattle, and they're called bovatieri on account of that, boi meaning bulls in Italian. His treatise on nobility, about what it means to be noble, Poggio describes this class as follows. The Romans who are called nobles look down on trade as a common and lowly enterprise. They consider it honorable and worthy of a noble man to devote himself to cultivating fields and agricultural pursuits, to take care of flocks and herds, and to seek wealth from sheep and cattle. For those who can do these things, even if their families are new, access opens to the nobility on the basis of this kind of profit. Among the Romans, there is an honest, albeit rustic, sort of nobility, far different from that of Naples. So, as Poggio's text indicates, in the rest of Italy, there was a certain social opprobrium attached to being a cattle herder. And so, towards the end of the 14th century and into the 15th century, these families start branching out into what you might call white collar professions. They become property dealers, lawyers, doctors, that sort of thing. And of course, with the return of the papacy to Rome, there opens a new employment market and career path in the papal curia. Now, about the Rustici, we know very little about the generations before Cencio. But as with many families among the Bovatieri, like the Buffalo, Buffalini, Porcari, Cencio's surname, Rustici, points to an agrarian occupation. Indeed, it's the resoundingly negative connotations of rusticus in classical Latin. It means like peasant, farmer, boor, may well be one of the reasons why he prefers to use the epithet Romanus instead of his family name. The association with the Bovatieri class is also evident in the Rustici marriage alliances, in as much as we can trace them. So Cencio's only recorded daughter, Brigida, married into the Della Valle family. Her husband's name was Lello, also Lelio. And scholars have cited precisely the social ascendancy of the Della Valle as a typical example of the Bovatieri. They accumulated landed wealth in the 14th century, invested in urban properties by the end of that century, and then embarked on medical and legal careers, particularly in the papal curia. And this was a match that was so suited to the Rustici that it was repeated in the next generation when Cencio's grandson Francesco married a Sigismunda della Valle. It's instructive also to compare the career paths of Cencio's sons and his son-in-law, Lello. I'm skipping over the details here, but just to note the parallels. Just like Cencio's son Agapito made the rank of bishop, so did one of the Della Valle brothers, Pietro. Agapito had first studied law, and in fact his coeval at Padova was none other than Lello della Valle, who then later worked as lawyer in the Curia, where Marcello de Rustici was apostolic secretary. The same Marcello also served as cancelliere of Rome's municipal government, which was in fact a papal appointment, whilst his brother Paolo de Rustici, probably Cencio's eldest son, held the office of conservatore of the Commune of Rome. And as it happens, the father of the Della Valle brothers, Paolo, had held the same positions in Rome's municipal government in his generation, just like they also had a bishop, Paolo's brother Nicola, a generation before the Rustici got there with Agapito. So they're very, very similar families, but with except that perhaps the Della Valle are a bit senior to the Rustici. And I mean, obviously, such family ties are also, or perhaps primarily, professional ties and business ties. La Famiglia is an enterprise. So it's worth noting that the Rustici and Della Valle sons, brothers, shared financial as is shown by a letter from Poggio to Marcello de Rustici, in which he also mentions Nicola and Lello della Valle. This brings us to the crucial topics of networking and patronage. The ascent of the Rustici and della Valle would have been impossible without papal patronage. And indeed, the Della Valle were conspicuous supporters of the Colonna, at least since Paolo della Valle served as the doctor to Martin V, whose own name, of course, was Oddone Colonna. That's to say, he was a member of one of those two important baronial families, the Colonna and the Orsini. Furthermore, in 1455, Lello della Valle was tasked by Pope Calixtus III with the task of keeping the Orsini, the other faction, out of Rome, while in 1484 the houses of Lello and his brothers Giacomo and Filippo were torn down in retaliation for their Colonna partisanship. In this context, it is significant that the father, Paolo della Valle, was a member of the confraternity of San Salvatore at Sancta Sanctorum. This was not only the most elite society of late medieval, early Renaissance Rome, but it was also particularly tied to the Colonna and its chapel, which is a stone's throw away from San Giovanni in Laterano, where Martin V actually lived when he was a pope and where he still lies buried. That chapel, that building of Sancta Sanctorum also served as the personal chapel for the pope. Interestingly, Cencio, in one of his letters, writes about the religious experience that one feels when entering this holiest of holies, Sancta Sanctorum. And note also here that the play of words about place, between his letter and the mosaic inscription in the chapel that you see in the image. Interestingly, in this letter, there's really no good reason for Cencio to mention Sancta Sanctorum other than to underline the shared bonds of belonging to this quite exclusive club that connect him and the unknown addressee of this letter. There is no direct evidence that Cencio belonged to the Colonna faction, but signs are that Martin V looked favorably upon him. While Cencio did not owe his beginnings in the Curia to the Colonna Pope, he first served under Innocent VII, Martin did rehire him and promote him to Apostolic Secretary. And this was not business as usual, because Martin V's election at Constance in 1417 ended the Western Schism. Three rival papal curias had to be merged into one, so many employees lost their position. And indeed, Poggio's career took the reverse course compared to Cencio's. Poggio was already an apostolic secretary under Innocent VII, and he was then offered renewed employment by Martin only at the lower level of apostolic scribe. And Poggio actually refuses that demotion and then joins Cardinal Henry Beaufort in England instead. So, what accounts for the discrepancy between Cencio and Poggio's fortunes? One possibility may lie simply in their personal character. Poggio's letters frequently testify to his tendency to step on people's toes for the sake of a good joke. Cencio, on the other hand, is described by a near contemporary, Vespasiano da Bisticci, as a taciturn person and quite reluctant to show his true colors. Those are probably better qualities for a diplomatic career. But the other significant difference lies in their descent. The man known as Poggius Florentinus came from the Tuscan town of Terranuova. Cencio himself was and called himself Romanus, as was Martin V. Now, an example of how Rome could be an asset for patronage is found in two letters of Cencio to a certain Giuliano, who remains unidentified but must also be a Roman, because Cencio references Rome as our city. So these letters, significantly, are really about patronage. Cencio tells his recipient that he's recommended him to the Pope and that the Pope seemed pleased with the recommendation. But also in both letters, especially the second one, there's an extensive discussion about the city of Rome, and I'll return to the content of that discussion in a bit. First, though, who were the people involved? The Pope was very likely once again Martin V, for Cencio claims that our Lord will raise the city of Rome from its miseries. And as you saw just now, underneath the portrait of Martin V, urban regeneration was part of the program of this Colonna Pope. For instance, he revived the office of the Maestri di Strada, Rome's public works, in 1425. A plausible candidate for the addressee is Giuliano Cesarini, to whom Cencio later directs a letter when he's become cardinal as Pater Julianus Cardinalis. Cesarini made a meteoric rise through the papal hierarchy under Martin. In October 1422, he's recorded in a pontifical document as the Pope's personal chaplain, serving, that is, at Sancta Sanctorum. In 1424, he's auditor of the Curia, and by 1425, he was the papal ambassador to France. He was elevated to the cardinalate by Martin V in 1426, when he was not even 30 years old. So any of these appointments may have benefited from Cencio's intervention. Conversely, Cencio would naturally expect reciprocal favors, and indeed his later letter to Cardinal Cesarini thanks him for his particular goodwill, not merely towards Cencio himself, but towards his offspring and his whole family. And actually, I think that there is probably a family connection between the two men through the maternal line, for Cesarini's mother was called Paolotia di Lorenzo de' Rustici, and that's all we know about her. But I did find evidence of shared business interests between Giuliano's younger brother Giorgio Cesarini, who, as we saw in Biondo's text, lived in the same building block as Cencio, and Marcello de' Rustici, and also the Della Valle. Namely, they purchased property together, landed property outside Rome in 1465. Finally, the allegiance of Cesarini to the Colonna cannot be in doubt. From 26, in fact, so precisely in the years of the ascent of Giuliano, their coat of arms changes to incorporate a reference to the Colonna, and it becomes a bear chained to a column, which symbolizes the subjugation of the Orsini to the Colonna, because Orso is bear and Colonna obviously means column. And later, this coat of arms becomes crowned by the imperial eagle, and the whole assemblage then gives rise to this biting satire verse where it says, "Give the Orsini their bear back, and the Colonna their column. Give the eagle back to the empire. Only the chain is your own." That's a pasquinata, like the critical poetry attached to Rome's statues at the time and still today at the Pasquino south of Navona. Anyway, so I think Cencio's letters to Giuliano are to Cesarini. Now, why does he talk about Rome in these letters that really are about patronage, and what does he say about the city of Rome? The second letter in particular is very emotional. Cencio says that he imagines Cesarini crying about Rome's latest calamity, like a mother cries for the death of her only son. He doesn't actually specify what calamity Rome has suffered now, but I think it might be the flood of 1422, which is recorded in the diary of Stefano, who records that there was so much water because of the flood that Rome was inundated and that it did enormous damage. He also says that the flood is commemorated with a stone in the facade of the Santa Maria sopra Minerva, and that stone in fact is still there, and it measures how high the water was, at least 1.5 meters above street level. But of course, you know, I don't know at least how current street level compares to what it was in 1422. In any case, if you think of the location of Cencio's house, and possibly also the house of Cesarini's younger brother Giorgio, if he already lived there at the time, just across the road from the Minerva, then it's no wonder that they were both crying. In any case, in this letter, Cencio sets out to lift Cesarini's spirits in the form of an anecdote. And it's such a charming passage that I'll paraphrase the whole thing. Cencio tells, a couple of days ago, I bought new clothes for my young boys with decorations on them. Stitched onto the fabric in wool is the image of the Roman she-wolf suckling the infants Romulus and Remus along the banks of the Tiber, just like the historians describe it. And then, in a circle around this emblem, in silk letters, are the following words: Però si vuol sperare, yet one must hope. So, what you should imagine here is Cencio's son in sort of like an AS Roma outfit, here by Charlie. Why all this? Because, Cencio says, given that God saw fit to intervene and save the city's future founders, Romulus and Remus, from dangers which without divine assistance they could not possibly have survived, that clearly shows that God will never take his merciful eyes off the city of Rome. So what Cencio does here is he Christianizes Rome's foundation myth, which Livy reports and Livy calls a marvelous story, and he attributes it to the fates. For Cencio, this is all about divine providence. And from this, he then seamlessly moves on to the promise that Christ made to the apostles, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world. And with this, Cencio maintains Christ was saying that the church will always be with us, and since the foundation of the church lies in the city of Rome, it is impossible that God will ever abandon Rome. So, by foregrounding Rome, Cencio first of all underlines a shared identity between himself and Cesarini as Romans. But Rome is also something bigger than just a homeland. It's providential, but it's in need of renewal after its so manyest calamity. And this, in fact, is exactly what Cencio promises Cesarini that the current Pope will do. Now, it's useful to compare and contrast this with a letter of Cencio's a few years earlier, significantly just before the election of Martin V. So this is written in 1416 and addressed to Francesco da Fiano, who was a leading figure in the Curia in the previous generation and something of a mentor figure to Cencio. In this letter, Cencio chides the Romans for having failed to preserve Latin culture. They have allowed the collapse of libraries, whose location can still be deduced from Greek inscriptions, and they've used the pages of the books to paint the face of Saint Veronica onto them. And no less bad than that is the destruction of Rome's physical monuments. And Cencio describes how modern Romans actively destroy the amphitheaters, the hippodromes, the statues, etc., all to expiate false gods. But in fact, he argues, it's not against religion to look at beautiful statues of Venus or of Hercules and to admire the, I quote, almost divine genius with which they are made, and their, I quote again, lifelike breathing quality. And finally, then, Cencio laments the involvement of Rome's governors and also past popes in this misguided vandalism and urges Fiano, my teacher, to write against this, to agitate against this. Now, however sincere this sentiment may be, there's something artificial about this letter. For Francesco da Fiano had himself written a treatise called Against the Absurd Slanderers of the Pagan Poets, which is about whether or not it is okay for Christians to read pagan ancient poetry. And Fiano had argued that Christians can indeed read and appreciate pagan poets, as long as they understand that God's word is greater still. So what Cencio is doing here is that he's quoting his master back at himself, probably the sincerest form of flattery. But he is also extending Fiano's arguments from Roman literature to Rome's physical remains. to the amphitheaters, the statues, etc. Finally, he also indicates how past popes were complicit in the city's destruction, and so he carves out a niche that Martin V would step into as urban regenerator. So I would say that what we see here is a form of self-fashioning. Cencio, Cesarini, Francesco da Fiano, they all show themselves capable of appreciating Rome's classical remains, which others spurn and destroy, and this also then qualifies them to play a role in Rome's renewal. It's interesting to compare Cencio's evocations of Rome to those of others. On the one hand, the medieval tradition of the Mirabilia, but also earlier and roughly contemporary humanists such as Petrarch, Pier Paolo Vergerio, Manuel Chrysoloras, and of course also to the classical tradition that they draw on, Virgil, Ovid, etc. And here I want to say thanks to Ben. We discussed sort of ancient visions of Rome over dinner, and the next day I found this massive pile of books about that on my desk, which was really great. So cheers. So if you know map Cencio's descriptions of Rome against these others, you'll find that he constantly echoes what his contemporaries in the same curial circle. So, for instance, the point about books being destroyed to paint the faces of the saints is also made by Vergerio. The use of Greek inscriptions to identify Roman buildings. We also see that in Chrysoloras, who was Cencio's Greek teacher from 1409, making Cencio one of the first people to learn Greek in Rome, maybe the first person to learn Greek in Rome, actually. Now, these allusions are not a lack of imagination, I think. I think rather that by quoting and paraphrasing each other, these people are consolidating the intellectual bonds between them. They're showing, we appreciate the classical past because we're all learned men. We can see what ordinary folks cannot see, and we are also the ones that, if I may say so, will make the city great again. Right, finally, I want to raise some ideas for what all of this means for the engagement with Rome's physical remains, not just in writing, but material remains. And these are possibilities, really. I can't prove anything. But my hypothesis is if these people are so interested in Roman remains, if they admire statues and inscriptions, if they worry about their destruction, what would be more logical than to start collecting them so you can preserve them? And we know indeed that there were antiquities collections in Rome in the later 15th century. There's a lot of scholarship on those. And both the Della Valle and the Cesarini had significant collections from the late 15th century and into the 16th century. But can we push that back to this earlier curial circle in the first half of the 15th century? Well, we know that Poggio, for one, was seeking to import statue heads from Greece in the 1420s, which incidentally he also admired because of their life-breathing quality. We also know that by 1423, Paolo della Valle displayed the head of a statue of Jupiter, or a bust of Jupiter, in one of his houses, possibly above the front door. That bust is now shown in the Capitoline Museum. But I haven't been able to find any sculpture that is associated with Cencio himself or with his offspring. When it comes to inscriptions, there are some tantalizing glimpses. Again, we know that Poggio collected inscriptions in the sense that he copied them, that's to say, he transcribed them, and he started doing that as early as 1403, and indeed Poggio's are the first epigraphic syllogists, so books compiling inscriptions. What we don't know is whether Poggio collected inscriptions in the physical sense of bringing together inscribed Roman stones and displaying them. This is precisely what the next generations of Romans started doing, and we find such inscriptions recorded in later sillages with indications of whose house they are in, sort of instead of the original location in the city or on the Roman monuments that they were originally on. Here are a few examples of some of these Roman inscriptions that were owned by Lello della Valle and also by his brothers. And in all likelihood, they were immured into the wall, as like you see in the example on the right. Now, I thought I'd found some inscriptions that were owned by Cencio in this way, and what's more, they include a Greek inscription which would be particularly apt, given his knowledge of Greek, his unique knowledge, you may say, of Greek at the time. And this one is reported equal, like the collection of Christian inscriptions of the city of Rome. And indeed, in the introduction, the editor of Icor notes that this inscription is found apud Cincium, so at Cencio's, in his house. However, when I checked the inscription against the original manuscript copy of the sillage where it first appears, the location is actually given slightly differently, as you can see here. It says Rome in the house of the Cenci behind Santa Maria sopra Minerva. And this is problematic because there is actually a Roman family called the Cenci. So, it could be that this inscription was owned by the Cenci rather than by our Cencio de Rustici. On the other hand, the location is of course interesting because all the Cenci I know of in the 15th century lived in the Rione of Regola or Rione Sant'Angelo, whereas of course behind the Minerva is precisely where our Cencio lived. It's entirely possible that a mistake has been made in copying the manuscript, especially because they often use abbreviations in these sillages. So they don't write Cinciorum, which would be the Cenci, but they simply write Cinci with like some kind of squiggly thing above, which could easily get lost. But of course, that's impossible to prove either way. In addition, I found a reference to a manuscript now in the Ambrosiana in Milan, which supposedly contains, I quote, ancient epitaphs found in Rome and poems found in Rome in the hall, aula of Cencio Romano. Now, epitaphs is a common word for inscriptions, so I imagine that these would be Roman inscriptions built into the walls of Cencio's aula, Cencio's hall. But when I got the manuscript, it turns out actually that different sections. So on the left page, there's an ancient epitaph, which essentially is a long poem. And of course, the other meaning of epitaph is not inscription, but funerary poem, which is what this seems to be. And then if you turn the page, the verso, there are verses found in Cencio's hall. So, what then is that thing that was found in Cencio's hall? Is it perhaps a poem that Cencio himself wrote, if it's not a Roman inscription? It might well be. We know that contemporaries praised his skill as a poet, rightly or wrongly. So in that case, this might be an unedited poem by Cencio, described and translated it here, which is nice, but it's not the Roman inscription I was looking for. But then again, if it was his own poetry, how exactly was it found in his hall? Did he have it painted onto his wall, or was it chiseled into his wall? As if it were an inscription. I really don't know. Finally, something else that is at least remarkable. If you go to the bottom of the page, you can maybe just see Disticum Antiquissimum, or a very old distich, and it reads as follows: "We are deceived by prayers and tricked by time, and death laughs at our worries. Troublesome life is nothing." Now, who knows if this has got anything to do with Chencho? Maybe not, because there's a line of Horace in between the two poems. But the strange thing is, this same text later turns up in the inscription collection of the Della Valle. There we have it. Not just that, here it comes in a slightly different form, because now it's like an actual Roman funerary inscription in which grieving parents address the death of their daughter, Paulina, and give information about how long she lived. So in this format, it suggests it's an actual inscribed Roman stone, not just a piece of humanist poetry. And we can't tell because the stone no longer exists, if it ever did. But then there's a further twist. While this inscription with the Paulina bit and Vixit Annie lived 6 years, while that is included in 17th century collections of Roman inscriptions, such as Gruterus, it is not included in the modern definitive collection of Latin inscriptions, the CIL. And the reason, presumably, is that it's not a real Roman inscription, but a forgery. Or perhaps it's more accurate to say a Renaissance invention. So is this then also a poem of Chencho's, which maybe was inscribed in stone and added to the Della Valle collection? Or, wildly speculating here, was it written by him for an actual Della Valle girl who died age 6, say a daughter of Lello della Valle and Brigida de Rustici? Who knows? I'll say one more thing though. Humanist epitaphs of this type became extremely common later in the 15th century, and we see them, for instance, in the Della Valle family chapel in Santa Maria in Arezzo. So the first image shows an inscription that takes the form of a dialogue between the dead bishop Pietro della Valle and his brothers, including Lello. And the second is a prose inscription after the Roman model of the type I just showed that was in the collection of Lello. And this particular one is probably written by Lello himself for his son Niccolo, who predeceased him. So for Chencho's grandson. And like the Rustici tombs that I started off with, these monuments were partly made retroactively. So, for instance, at the right you see an inscription for Paolo della Valle, who died in 1440, which is sort of incorporated with other funerary inscriptions into this larger monument, which was made in the late 15th century. Also, like the Rustici tombs, which emphasized the learning of these family members. So as you saw, Chencho was called an expert in both Greek and Latin, and Agapito was called most expert in Latin. In the same way, the Della Valle stressed their learning. So here you see Filippo della Valle, who is praised as renowned for philosophy and the literary arts. And in fact, he's even depicted as lying there as a corpse, propped up by his collection of books. So, if nothing else, these are two families who are extremely conscious of learning as cultural capital. And I hope to have shown the importance of Rome as part of that cultural capital in their social ascent from cowherders to urban and papal elites. This includes Rome as a place of birth and a site for patronage, but also Rome as an ancient heritage to be treasured, to be studied, and maybe to be collected. It is providential Rome as it was promised by the Christian God, but finally it's also contemporary Rome whose rebirth these men made their common goal. So thank you for your attention, and I hope you will join the discussion on Monday, 7 December on 6 p.m. In Roman time. Thank you.